some of the changes that come as a result of the interactions by different societies, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what we might call the reordering of the world of different civilizations, some positive changes, some negative changes, things that people thought ought to happen. So, for example, the British in India advocating against practices such as sati. We also saw how Christianization became one of the major goals. And again, if you have bigger populations, you have more catchment for a new religion. But also the ultimate British control of arguably one of their best or their most profitable colonies, India. And so it's, I think, important to continue looking at other impacts elsewhere. So for the British, French, Germans, you're going to see that their colonization and control begins to manifest much later on, unlike that of the French, of the Spanish, and the Portuguese. It had similarly significant impacts, and so we shall see some of these, but we'll also see some of the strategies that, for example, the British used. So control and, or rather, divide and conquer to control the various population they come into contact with. So British rule changes, but again, it's important to remember that this is still the rule by the British East India Company. As we mentioned, the British government will take over colonization of India after 1858, and this is brought about by how the British react to the Indian First War of Independence, or what some people call the Sepoy Mutiny. Sepoys were troops that were recruited by the British East India Company to fight on their behalf. So again, this is unusual because you have a company having soldiers, and that this is not necessarily a common occurrence. Cultural changes, as we mentioned, were promoted by the British. So, for example, the end to sati, linguistic changes such as English replacing Persian, but also creating a civil service that was fashioned after the one you find in the UK. And so, but for this particular change of the civil service, it would become part of the reason the British rule ends in India because of Mahatma Gandhi. We'll talk about Mahatma Gandhi later on when we talk about Indian independence. But again, British rule wasn't necessarily very stable because they didn't have enough people to rule on their behalf. And so what we are sort of doing is looking at different administrations, different empires, different civilizations, and how these contact with the outside changes them or affects them. Now, one of the then existing civilizations was the Qing Empire in India. So if you go east from India, maybe we should take a look at this. So actually north and east, you see where China is. At this time, it was under the rule of the Qing Empire. And so it's important to see what industrialization in Europe, but also these increasing interactions do for the Qing, for China. Yeah, and sort of how China deals with these changes. And so what we are talking about is the period from about 1790s. And we previously mentioned that the Chinese and Indian economies were the largest in the world, accounting for more than half of the GDP, of the global GDP. And so what does industrialization do for Europe? So European upheavals, so like the revolution and so on, did not necessarily affect China. Instead, China is going to be affected by internal issues, so rebellions within China, but also a bit of external intervention. So by about 1870s, Japanese are beginning to encroach on China. But other issues included, for example, the rapidly growing population. And so if you're still a primarily agricultural economy, you have to think about how to feed your population. But they're also buffeted by other issues such as opium. Now, opium had been used in China and India for a very long time, and it was generally used as a palliative, as a way to dull pain. So it was used for medicinal purposes. But especially when it was mixed with tobacco, its effect became more insidious. And so actually by about 1729, the Qing Empire is beginning to think about how to decrease the use of opium, the smoking of opium, because it's beginning to see addiction and people not really doing much by the way of work. So they are beginning to sort of think about how to cut down this dependency. Now, you probably, I mean, it's true that things that are usually legal have very high profits, but also outlawing something generally makes it go underground. So think about drugs even in this country. And how a government or authorities deal with an issue also has implications in how it's going to either survive or be eliminated. And so by 1729, the Qing Empire decides to eliminate or to outlaw the smoking of opium, but it's not like people are smoking opium in the open. Even though it was clearly being used a lot in places like Canton and Hong Kong, which were some of the most wealthy areas where Chinese people lived, and also foreigners. And so the question that then faces the Qing Empire is whether to legalize opium and tax it, or outlaw it and do something with it. And so this actually all comes from the British still wanting to find something that the Chinese want. And so it seems like the British became some of the biggest drug dealers in the world from about the 18th century, 1700s, to about 1850. In fact, at some point, they are going to ask that opium be legalized through a treaty with the Chinese. So this use past medicinal qualities is what begins to addict so many people. And so when people become addicted, they stop being very productive. They are not going to work. They are not eating. So it actually becomes even dangerous for them. So, but again, you can sort of see where some of the opium is being manufactured. So Patna, which is in India, which was controlled by the British, becomes one of the major sources of opium. Um, the British East India Company soldiers are bootlegging. Bootlegging is the smuggling of prohibited goods, and so they are bootlegging the opium into Canton and other places, and they are actually building ships that are designed to evade Chinese Navy. Now, to this end, they actually had a bit of a strategy because part of what they do is build ships, steamships. Now, again, think about the prevalence of like what kinds of ships were sailing for the most part during that time. And most of them were sailing ships. So you have this big sail and you go where the wind takes you. But if you have steamship, then you are more able to steer the ship where you want it to go. And so they begin to build armed ships and offload the opium where government authorities are not, which is so lightly occupied islands. And so if you are still using a sailing ship and you can't go to those islands, so a lot of illicit activity goes on. Now, the Chinese, of course, had the incentive to sell opium because it's, high profits and but so we actually begin to see a lot of piracy and lawlessness. In fact, there's a story that is told of a woman who was a very well-renowned pirate. She had a fleet of about 20-something ships, Chinese. Eventually, she went over to the government, but smuggling opium was a very lucrative undertaking. Now, so these are kind of the pipes that were used to smoke opium. Some were actually longer than those. And so by about 1830s, the Qing Emperor is trying to figure out what to do with opium. And so he appoints a drug czar whose job is to do a couple of things. One, to stop the smuggling of opium, stop the consumption of opium, establish recovery stations or places, but also ensure that the Chinese people are not helping Europeans, especially the British, to smuggle the opium. And so what Lin eventually does is of course, there's this huge debate, legalize it and tax it or outlaw it. And so Lin is put in charge of outlawing it. And so part of what he does is he does a couple of things, actually. One, he confiscates all the opium that was in the ports, especially in Shanghai, destroys it, he burns it, and washes out the ashes into the ocean. So then he withdraws all the Chinese port workers to British ships. So, of course, ships don't carry too many people. They get loaded with stuff and then they sail, and you have people in the port to offload them. So he removes the people who would offload these ships until the British merchants agree not to smuggle opium. The third thing that he does is he puts together recovery places, so sort of like rehab. And then he makes the British and European traders to sign an agreement saying they are not going to smuggle opium anymore. Now, I think he was naive to think that they were going to do that. So for a while, it kind of seems like he has this contained. But what then happens is the British, now you have to understand the British always wanted to trade more with the Chinese, to have more ports open to them to trade with, to have ambassadors to China. And so this becomes their golden opportunity to do these things. So in Parliament, there's a discussion over what the British should do. And so eventually they decide to go to war against China. Now, their biggest thing was representation and trade. But they also asked for the opium that was destroyed to be paid for. Now, I don't know if or who would actually say something like that, but so that was one of the conditions, and of course the Chinese government refuses to pay for the opium because you're poisoning our people. Why are we paying you for poisoning us? So the British declare war on China, which is generally referred to as the First Opium War. It's fought over 3 years, 1839 to 1842. The British generally win. They had better weapons, better ships um, that could be navigated more easily. And so at the end of the war, a treaty is signed between the Chinese and the British, and this is the Treaty of Nanjing. There are 3 treaties that I'm going to ask you to remember that are signed together with China. The Treaty of Nanjing of 1842, the Treaty of Tianjin, 1858, and the Boxer Protocols in about 1900. Now, these are treaties that are generally referred to as unequal treaties because it's almost like Europeans get everything they want, and whoever they are signing these treaties with really get nothing. If you think about the treaties that, for example, were signed with Native Americans here, these would also be examples of unequal treaties. And so the treaty does a couple of things, including, for example, giving Hong Kong or control of Hong Kong to the British. And so the Hong Kong would be in British hands for the next 100 and maybe 50 something years, 155. So, and this is where we say the implications of history. Hong Kong went back to China to Chinese control in 1997. By then, of course, the British had made it like Britain, so now there's all kinds of issues with Hong Kong because the Chinese have been trying to impose Chinese rule. The Qing were also forced to pay for the cost of war. So this is often what we call indemnity. So if you fight people and you defeat them, usually, which makes no sense, you charge them for the costs of the war. This happened, for example, with Germany in the First World War, the Second World War. Yeah. The current Russia-Ukraine war, you might also hear reparations being paid by Russia for destroying Ukrainian things. But so the Chinese are required to pay, I think it was 21 million silver dollars. And these were for the war and for the opium, which is, again, it's just insane. Now, there would be other treaties, and we'll talk about this. There's going to be other things that are imposed on the Chinese, and we'll also talk about them. But so in terms of, global trade brings in these sometimes good products and sometimes, I think, insidious products. So for example, these were the major trafficking routes for cocaine and opiates. Opiates include opium. You can see sort of where they were grown. So coca and opium primarily grown in South America and parts of Central America, but also in Afghanistan and India. Again, remember the British control India, so it's easy to move opium from India to move it east to China. So the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle. This is where most of the opium came out of. So again, the Qing Emperor decides to ask Lin to deal with the opium, 20,000 chests. Yeah, so apparently he washes it out into the ocean and then offers prayers to the sea spirits for poisoning them with this opium. And so these are the chests that we are talking about, they would have been about this size, so about 1,400 tons of opium. It took about maybe a week to burn, so that was quite a bit of opium. Now, so at the end of the Opium War, the first Opium War, there were actually two Opium Wars. So the first Opium War and the second Opium War. So at the end of the first Opium War, part of the treaty was opening up ports to foreign commerce. So initially it was just Shanghai and Xiamen that were available to especially Westerners. And so eventually 5 ports are opened, and the British also have the ability or they write into the treaty the right to send ambassadors to Beijing. And so if you actually think about what the British wanted, so they wanted foreign representation, more ports. So these are the conditions of the first Treaty of Nanking, or the treaty after the first Opium War, the 5 or 7 major elements of the treaty. So extraterritoriality, sounds like a tongue twister. Extraterritoriality is kind of what today we might refer to as diplomatic immunity. So if you're a diplomat of a certain caliber, actually if you're a diplomat sent to another country, generally you're not subject to the laws of that country. You are subject to the laws of your country. This can be a problem, and this is how.
So what if you're married and you still have to follow?
Well, the question is whether you are considered a diplomat. Now, diplomats are not just ambassadors. They can even be political officers. They can be, so a lot of times you'll hear like attaches. So attaches are like FBI people in a foreign embassy, but they are given diplomatic immunity because then that covers them. Now, if you are, did you say married? To who?
Like if you were married to another diplomat,
Not necessarily. So, okay, let's take a practical example. You are married to a diplomat and you go to Canada. Technically, no. So, if you, it's an interesting question. If you're married to an American diplomat who is posted to Canada, you do not have diplomatic immunity, unless you're like the ambassador's wife, so like because also like if you have diplomatic immunity, you have a diplomatic passport, so you get through airports quickly and security lines and so on. But if you're just like, or the child of a diplomat, now usually those people want to cover their families with diplomatic immunity because that's a political decision. It's not, it's a political decision. But generally, if diplomatic immunity is not extended to you, which would be very odd because then you'd need visas and then you're not covered. Most of the time, families get covered. So like they'll go under like a family group and they have diplomatic immunity. Now, here's the problem. So you're not subject to the laws of the country in which you are. So, and this actually begins, like if you think about the American Revolution, the people who came to the New World that was sent by King George could not be prosecuted by American law. Now, so if I shot someone in the middle of Fifth Street in New York, like what would happen to me? In theory, I'd be taken back to the country that sent me, and that's who would try me. Here's the problem with that. If there's like 200 Europeans in China, and one of them does something wrong, they should be tried by the European governments. These are friends, so really nothing happens to them. There's an example. Let me give you an example of a diplomatic incident that happened that shows you the differences in law. A few years ago, maybe 2017, there was an Indian diplomat working at the UN, the India's UN mission, and they had an individual who was serving as house help. Now, house help in some parts of the world are not um, very well treated. So, for example, this particular woman had her passport taken, she wouldn't get breaks, wouldn't get all her money. And so that clearly violates American law. And so one day she calls 911 and NYPD respond. So clearly this is an instance of maybe something like working under conditions of slavery or forcible labor. And so that is something the government here can deal with, that outlaws. But the Indian person had diplomatic immunity, so how do you deal with this? Now, initially she was arrested, but then India asserted that she had diplomatic immunity, so she was released. And after she was released, she kind of went back to India, where that is not such a crime. Okay, so you lose your job, but you don't go to jail. So this extraterritoriality, or the modern version of diplomatic immunity, can be problematic if you decide to break the law. There was another incident in Britain where an American hit someone who was on a bicycle, a British, think he might have been a teenager or a young man, and he died. And so since she had diplomatic immunity, eventually she returned to the US. And there was a whole discussion of whether she should go back and face consequences. And of course, the US was saying we cannot extradite someone who has diplomatic immunity to come to stand trial in Britain. This can be a problem, but it can also be useful because it shields people from arbitrary arrest and those kinds of things. Now, the MFN is generally referred to as the most favored nation status. So if you have a most favored nation status with one country, the Treaty of Nanking required that you extend that to the British. Here's an example of most favored nation status. The United States, Australia, and the UK are working on an initiative for nuclear-powered submarines. Now, there are sensitive technologies that you do not want your enemies to have. For example, nuclear technology that powers submarines. And so unless the country is a most favored nation, you don't give them some trade secrets. Or, for example, the United States sells its most advanced jet fighter, the F-35, to Israel, Norway, UK, but probably won't sell it to like Turkey, even though they are kind of allies. And so the degree of friendship determines what you can allow the other country to do. And so you extend most favored nation trade status to other countries, and you can trade in sensitive goods, or you give them different trade terms. So for example, think of USMCA, or what used to be called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Association. Now, ambassadors, of course, are obvious. Ambassadors are representatives of one country to the next country. And so until about 1842, the Chinese did not allow ambassadors to reside in China. They were like, no, we do not want foreigners living among us. So the treaty also required the opening of 5 ports to international trade, as opposed to 1 or 2. A fixed tariff on imported goods that was maxed at 5%. So goods coming into China could not be charged more than 5% of their value. And as we mentioned, the indemnity to cover the war costs and the destroyed opium, and of course Hong Kong going to China. Now, in the second unequal treaty, which would be the Treaty of Tientsin, the British would get another district of Hong Kong called Kowloon. And again, this is sort of like ceding sovereignty to a foreign power. Later on, you're going to find all European powers coming in and saying, oh, we are going to append our signature to this treaty, so China has to treat us all the same as they do the British. Now, the question of, or the response to this treaty was outrage, both in the UK and in China, in part because the UK was like, are we really doing this? And so in China especially, there were questions of whether the Chinese should compromise with what they call the sea barbarians. Sea barbarians would come back to feature in another treaty, and the British would require for the Chinese not to call them sea barbarians anymore. And so all of this was blamed on Lin, and so he was exiled to northwest Guangzhou. And he was exiled there for about 10 years, but more importantly, the Qing begin to realize they have no navy. They are meeting these British forces with spears and swords and clubs and arrows, which is probably no way to fight. And so China goes into a period that is generally referred to as self-strengthening, and it's going to be led by Li Hongjiang and Yang Kang Yuwei. We'll talk about them much later. But so this is maybe a useful illustration of what the problem of the Chinese was. These are sailing ships, generally referred to as junks. To the bottom right is the British steamship. This another view here. And so steamships use both sails and steam engines, which turned not a propeller on the side of the ship. And so, I mean, they were still weaker because you could destroy the paddle steamer. Yeah, the paddle steamer. And if you destroy the paddle steamer, then the ship wasn't. But the Chinese didn't even have this. So they just had the junks. And so again, they lost the battle. Now, there were other reasons why the Chinese lost, and some of them include the fact that the military was not an honorable profession. People avoided being in the military, but also the Chinese Qing Empire did not really want to recruit more people, because remember, the Qing was made up of the Manchus. They are the minority. So if you're the minority, do you really want to give people guns? What if they turn them on you? And so the garrisons were scattered, the militia recruiting was not really emphasized, but also the Industrial Revolution begins to come in. For example, in the steam gunboat, the Nemesis, and this is that cutaway of the Nemesis. And it's actually fascinating to read about its being commissioned. Now, the Nemesis was not a British Navy vessel. In fact, it was a Navy vessel of the British East India Company, purposely built for smuggling opium. But it had guns. Like, why are you putting guns on? It's like if Walmart built I don't know, a jet fighter or a naval ship. Like, why? So there were, but again, you'll find that a lot of governments were giving these letters of marque, so that, you know, you say to the government, I'm going to bring you $1 million. Just give me the right to go and do stuff. So basically, they were given the right to go and be pirates, which makes no sense. Now, so we begin to see after the Treaty of Nanjing, the areas of China that are taken over by, or that European and Asian powers exercise influence, um, the insidious part of history is that, for example, the French take over the southern parts of China, what we often refer to as Indochina or French Indochina. That includes Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. And so they would control that region for about 100 years until the Americans went in, the Vietnam War. So again, sometimes we go in and correct other people's imperial desires. You see where the British had control over. Now, the later treaty, they would ask for the right to sail through the Yangtze River. I don't know if we have, yeah, so this next image, so the Yangtze River is kind of, it goes across China, which is sort of like, why are we allowing the British to sail across the Yangtze? It's almost like allowing, say, Russia to sail up the Mississippi all the way to Minnesota. Like, why are we doing that? But again, this is part of dismembering China, taking apart China, establishing the various areas of influence. But eventually, we actually begin to see the US coming to Chinese aid. So there's a very famous idea that most people refer to as open door policy. And open door policy was, so the US said nobody should colonize China, everybody should be free to trade. But this is about 1898. But so you can begin to see these encroachments by the French, the British, the Germans, the Russians. And so it's almost like China is being taken apart from inside and from outside. And so it's important to think about what will become of China as it tries to fight these foreign encroachments. Now, it's useful to review some of maybe key events, outcomes of that 1 century between 1750 and 1850. Again, remember we began with, for example, wars in North America, but also the seeds of revolution in British North America that would then come about in 1776, give rise to the French Revolution, inform the Haitian Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the movement of some kingdoms, for example, Portugal moves to Brazil, the development of new free states in Latin America, some elements of modernization, for example, in Russia, in the Ottoman Empire, the Tulip period, and so on. The development of the Industrial Revolution and its impacts, how it's going to allow the British, for example, to go and conquer parts of India and China, but also how countries around the world were trying to resist this encroachment. And so we are going to actually move into sort of seeing how this reordered world looked like, and some of the things that the people who were now encroached by foreigners were beginning to do. And so so Industrial Revolution, for example, and these imperialist developments bring about different visions. And some of these visions include imperialism, some of them include resistance, but also even within Europe itself, we actually see a lot of protest. So, for example, in 1848, we see worker dissatisfaction bringing about what we generally refer to as the European Spring. So many countries are toppled. But we also see the consolidation of territories under what is generally referred to as nationalism. So the French, the Greeks are looking at themselves as members of one nation. The idea of sovereignty, so who rules? So it's not just the kings and the monarchs, but it's almost like a shift towards talking about the people. We see a lot of nation states rising. So, for example, the Germans, the French, Italians consolidating. And so these are some of those kinds of new these new ideas about statehood, about how politics are organized. But we're also going to see other developments. So, for example, free trade. The question of whether mercantilism works better or whether there should be more free trade, whether markets should be regulated. We remember Adam Smith and his, invisible hand of the market. Questions of free labor as opposed to slave labor, which continue to be a significant method of production. So you think about, for example, the United States, Brazil, many countries that had not abolished their slavery systems or slave trade, but also how societies were going to be organized. Now, we also begin to see a communications revolution that at first glance was probably not super revolutionary. So newspapers and broadsheets, but again, remember in the American Revolution that this became part of the ways to discuss events, to defend positions. So, for example, the Federalist Papers are published and distributed. Think about new political communities, but also the death of some older political communities, for example, Native Americans being pushed west. And so we will see some of this. And so we can see this period as comprised of protest movements. We also see the rise of very interesting figures, especially maybe the 19th century prophets, radicals, common people. For example, in China, we are going to talk about the Taiping movement. In West Africa, we are going to talk about a number of caliphates that arose. And so, sort of thinking about where they got their, what they were protesting against, where they got their support, what kind of outcomes they produced, how similar they were, how the different visions challenged, for example, the now consolidating orders. So, for example, capitalism, colonialism, nation states. So, thinking about how the world is organized in the 19th century, especially mid 19th century, but also the role of religion. And you begin to see the number of revolts. So, for example, Muslim revolt in China causes the deaths of 21 million people. Later on, we are going to see the Taiping rebellion that causes about the deaths of 30 million people. And so it was a period of great economic advancement, but also of great rebellion, whether it's against the social and economic prevailing conditions or whether it's about people being controlled by others. So political, social, and economic revolutions, we see a bit of creation of new states, revitalization of traditions, religions, communities. And so even the non-European peoples are beginning to consider themselves, so when they form caliphates or kingdoms or other forms of political organization, these become ways of perhaps protest. Now, we previously mentioned that this is a period of the decline of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, so three major Islamic empires. But we also see the rise of other movements. And so these were not necessarily movements, they were more like, these were not empires, they were more like movements that had like one charismatic person. And then, of course, they were facing resistance, including from Europeans. So the role of prophets, theocratic governments, or religiously organized governments. And so we actually begin to see a revitalization of Muslim empires or Muslim rule. So, for example, in West Africa, and even in places like the Ottoman Empire, we don't see them completely fail. In places like the Sudan, you're going to see theocratic polities, countries, as instruments of God's will and vehicles for purifying places, people, civilizations. And one of those, I think, that whose impact continues even today is Muhammad al-Wahhab. And we are going to talk about him next week and his role in the creation of modern day Saudi Arabia. So together with Al Saud, so how he as a cleric combines with a tribal leader and they both adopt Islam as the religion of the territory. Again, they are going to establish Wahhabism in the Saudi kingdom, at least the first version, in a place that was claimed by the Ottoman Empire. So him become sort of the manifestation of some of these newer, modern day founder of Saudi Arabia, Muhammad ibn al Saud.